In the early autumn of 1928, the coastlines of the industrialized world were shrouded in an unusually persistent, heavy fog. From the rugged cliffs of Cornwall to the gray, churning waters of the Massachusetts Bay, the maritime world was operating on high alert. This was the era of the Great Transition, a time when the age-old reliance on lighthouses and visual signals was being superseded by the invisible reach of radio. To the coastal populations, the air felt thick with more than just mist. It was saturated with the crackle of the first generation of mass-market civilian radio broadcasts. But on a Tuesday evening in late September, that crackle was replaced by something else. It began as a low-frequency thrum, barely audible over the sound of the tide. Within hours, it had escalated into a high-pitched, piercing whine that seemed to emanate from the very horizon. To the sailors at sea, it was a warning. To the thousands of radio hobbyists in the coastal towns, it was a catastrophe. By dawn the following day, nearly every civilian radio transmission system within 50 miles of the coast had fallen silent. This wasn't a temporary outage. The systems didn't just lose signal. They were physically, and in many cases, permanently disabled. To understand why a coastal siren frequency in 1928 could reach through the airwaves and destroy the cutting-edge technology of its time, one has to look at the unique vulnerability of the early radio age. In 1928, radio was a Wild West. The vacuum tube was a recent luxury, and many civilian sets still relied on crystal detectors, delicate slivers of galena or silicon that were sensitive enough to catch a signal from 1,000 miles away, but fragile enough to be ruined by a stray spark. The maritime authorities, however, were not concerned with the hobbyists. They were concerned with the fog. Records suggest that the International Maritime Commission had authorized a new type of safety device, the high-intensity compressed air siren, designated as the H series. These weren't standard foghorns. They were designed to produce a sound so powerful it could penetrate the thickest Atlantic gale, vibrating at a specific frequency intended to be felt as much as heard. But that wasn't the strangest part. As the sirens were activated in a synchronized chain along the coast, the discovery of their unintended effect began in the repair shops of major cities. Engineers found that the radios brought in for service weren't just malfunctioning. The internal components, specifically the tuning coils and the crystal detectors, had undergone a physical change. The crystals had shattered into microscopic dust, and the copper windings of the coils showed signs of molecular fatigue, as if they had been subjected to a physical hammering. What they found next changed the narrative entirely. It wasn't the sound of the sirens that was destroying the radios. It was the harmonic resonance between the physical vibration of the compressed air and the electromagnetic frequency of the radio waves themselves. In 1928, many civilian transmitters operated on a frequency that, by a cruel twist of physics, was a perfect mathematical harmonic of the new siren's tone. The sirens were essentially pumping energy into the local atmosphere at a rate the early radios couldn't dissipate. Records suggest that as the sirens wailed, they created a standing wave of acoustic electric energy. This energy found its way into the antennas of civilian homes, turning every wire into a conductor for a massive invisible surge. This phenomenon, later known among a small circle of naval physicists as the siren's breath, was a localized EMP, an electromagnetic pulse decades before the term was even coined. The development of the crisis moved with terrifying speed. In cities like Boston and Liverpool, the radio silence was total. For the first time in the modern era, a technology had been uninvented overnight. The local newspapers reported a mysterious atmospheric disease that was killing the wireless. But in the halls of the Department of Commerce and the British Admiralty, the tone was much more calculated. They knew exactly what was happening. Some historians believe that the 1928 siren frequency wasn't a mistake at all. They point to the strategic reality of the time. The government was becoming increasingly wary of the unregulated airwaves. Thousands of independent civilian stations were clogging the frequencies that the military wanted for its own encrypted communications. By deploying a safety system that accidentally cleared the civilian spectrum, the authorities could achieve through infrastructure what they couldn't achieve through law. But that wasn't the strangest part of the official response. Instead of adjusting the frequency of the sirens to save the radios, the government did the opposite. They issued a mandatory shielding order. Every civilian radio station was required to install expensive government-approved harmonic dampers or face permanent revocation of their license. For the small, independent operators who couldn't afford the upgrades, the silence became permanent. The human cost of this silence was profound. In 1928, radio was the only lifeline for isolated coastal communities. When the sirens began to wail, that lifeline was severed. Personal stories from the era, found in the letters of coastal families, describe a sense of technological mourning. They spoke of the radios that would glow and hum during the fog, only to emit a sharp, electrical snap before going dark forever. To many, it felt as though the ocean itself was reclaiming the air. And that's when things began to shift. A young engineer at the Marconi Company named David Sarnoff, who would later lead RCA, wrote a confidential memorandum regarding the stability of the ether. He noted that the sirens were creating holes in the atmosphere, regions where no radio signal could survive. He warned that if the siren network were expanded, the entire coast would become a radio dead zone. Sarnoff's warning was ignored by the maritime boards, but it was noted by the military. They saw a new kind of weapon, acoustic interference. If a siren could disable a civilian radio, could it also disable the navigation systems of an enemy fleet? The 1928 event was the first documented case of electronic warfare being tested on a civilian population, masked as a safety improvement. What doesn't add up, however, is the persistence of the shadow. Even after the sirens were eventually phased out and replaced by electronic oscillators in the 1930s, the dead zones remained. Modern re-examinations of the coastal atmosphere have found that the soil and the old iron structures in these regions still exhibit a peculiar remnant magnetization. It is as if the 1928 frequency permanently altered the local magnetic environment. As the investigation into the siren frequency deepened, researchers found a set of maps in a naval warehouse in 2015. These maps, labeled Operation Low Tone, showed that the sirens were not placed for maximum auditory range. They were placed to create a grid of interference that perfectly overlaid the densest clusters of civilian radio transmitters. The escalation of the narrative reveals a world where the safety of the sailor was used as a pretext for the silencing of the citizen. The 1928 sirens weren't just fog signals, they were the first tools of a new, invisible sovereignty over the airwaves. And yet, as the final sirens were dismantled, a secret remained. In a remote station on the Irish coast, a single H-series siren was found to be still operational as late as 1974. It wasn't connected to any fog warning system. It was connected to a lead-shielded bunker buried deep beneath the lighthouse. What happened next remains unclear. The bunker discovered beneath the Irish lighthouse in 1974 was not a relic of the Cold War, as the local authorities initially assumed. It was a time capsule of the late 1920s, a subterranean hall of mirrors constructed of polished brass and lead-lined mahogany. Inside, researchers found a massive mechanical array of tuning forks, each nearly 5 feet tall, suspended in a vacuum-sealed chamber. This was the master oscillator, the brain of the H-series siren network. Records suggest that this facility was designed to synchronize the vibrations of every siren along the coast, with a precision that was theoretically impossible for the era. By linking the mechanical vibration of the sirens to this central hub, the Admiralty wasn't just making a louder noise. They were creating a phase-locked loop across the entire coastline. This meant that the sirens didn't just sound in unison, they created a singular, massive, and invisible wavefront that surged through the air like a physical wall. But the contents of the bunker were not what anyone expected. Alongside the tuning forks were hundreds of glass plates, each etched with the photographic record of interference patterns in the local atmosphere. These patterns didn't represent sound waves. They represented the ionization of the air itself. It was the first physical proof that the 1928 siren frequency had done more than just create a loud noise. It had fundamentally, and perhaps irreversibly, altered the electromagnetic properties of the coastal air. And that's when the forensic engineers found the physical proof of the damage. When they examined the ruins of the civilian radio sets that had been silenced in 1828, they found a phenomenon known as molecular etching. In the high-intensity field created by the sirens, the very atoms of the copper wires had been rearranged into a different crystalline structure. This etched copper no longer functioned as a conductor for radio frequencies. It had become an insulator. This is why the damage was permanent. You couldn't simply replace a blown fuse or a shattered crystal. The siren's breath had physically rewritten the metallurgy of the radio sets. It was as if the hardware had been cauterized by the sound. Some historians believe that this was the true hidden objective of Operation Lowtone, to create a physical lockout of civilian technology that no amount of repair work could bypass. But the strangest part was the timeline. While the Great Silence occurred in late September, the H-series sirens had been under construction for over 3 years. During that time, a series of early signs had been ignored by the public but closely monitored by the state. In 1926, residents near the test site in Cornwall reported that their cast-iron stoves would begin to sing whenever the fog rolled in. In 1927, farmers in Maine noticed that their wire fences would glow with a faint Blue Street Elmo's fire during the night, even when there was no storm in sight. These weren't supernatural events. They were the result of the atmosphere being preconditioned by low-level test frequencies. The air was being prepared, like a musical instrument being tuned, for the final, destructive surge of 1928. The development of the narrative takes an even more personal turn when we look at the accounts of the lighthouse keepers themselves. Unlike the radio operators, the keepers were given protective equipment that was far ahead of its time. Heavy, lead-lined silk hoods and earplugs made of a dense, wax-like compound. But even with this protection, many keepers reported a sensation that defied description. One keeper, Elias Thorne, wrote in his private journal that during the siren blasts, he could hear the thoughts of his fellow keepers as a series of rhythmic clicks. He described the feeling of his own teeth, vibrating with such intensity that he feared they would shatter. This acoustic coupling with the human nervous system suggests that the H-series frequency was operating on a level that bypassed the ears entirely, vibrating the very marrow of the bones. What doesn't add up is the official explanation for the siren's eventual decommissioning. In 1931, the government claimed that the sirens were being removed because they were too expensive to maintain and that the advent of electronic radio beacons made them obsolete. However, naval expenditure records show that the cost of dismantling the sirens was actually higher than the cost of running them for another 20 years. Some historians believe the sirens weren't removed because they were obsolete, but because they had worked too well. The radio dead zones they created weren't just blocking civilian broadcasts. They were beginning to interfere with the migration of birds and the navigation of the very ships they were meant to protect. The ocean was becoming acoustically toxic. The evidence layers of this toxicity were revealed in a 1990s study of deep-sea sediment near the old siren sites. Researchers found that the microscopic shells of marine organisms from the 1928 layer were deformed, their growth patterns stunted by a massive localized increase in electromagnetic stress. The sirens had reached down into the water, vibrating the very foundations of the coastal ecosystem. What they found next changed the understanding of the dead zones entirely. In the late 1940s, during the early days of the Cold War, the U.S. Navy attempted to establish a high-frequency communications array in a region that had been a siren site in 1928. They found that the air in that specific location was electrically dead. No matter how much power they pumped into the transmitter, the signal would simply dissipate within a few hundred yards. It was as if the 1928 event had left behind an atmospheric scar, a region of air that was permanently ionized and incapable of carrying a radio wave. These ghost zones still exist today. Pilots and amateur radio operators still report dead air near certain stretches of the coast, places where the modern digital world suddenly and inexplicably fails. And that's when the investigation into Operation Low Tone reached its most unsettling turning point. In 2018, a researcher at the National Archives discovered a set of target lists from 1928. These lists didn't contain the coordinates of dangerous shoals or rocky capes. They contained the addresses of the most powerful and politically active independent radio clubs in the country. The sirens hadn't been placed to guide ships. They had been placed to biologically and technologically neutralize the first generation of independent information sharers. In 1928, the government was terrified of the unseen power of the radio, the ability for a citizen to broadcast a message to thousands of others without a filter. The H-series sirens were the solution, an invisible, audible curfew that silenced the airwaves and reasserted the state's monopoly on the truth. But the story doesn't end with the decommissioning of the sirens. Some researchers believe that the frequency itself didn't disappear. They point to the hum, a persistent, low-frequency sound reported by thousands of people worldwide in recent decades. While there is no clear consensus on its origin, some believe it is the remnant echo of the 1928 network, a planetary-scale vibration that was set in motion nearly a century ago and has never quite stopped. The aftermath of 1928 was a world where radio was no longer a hobby for the many, but a regulated utility for the few. The molecular etching of the early sets served as a physical boundary, marking the end of the era of technological innocence. We moved from a world of open air to a world of managed spectrum, a shift that was inaugurated by the wail of a siren that was never meant to be a warning. What happened next remains unclear, as the final technical specifications for the master oscillator were reportedly destroyed in a controlled fire at the Admiralty in the 1980s. But the legacy of the silence remains, written into the dead zones of our coastlines and the etched copper of the forgotten radios. The investigation into the 1928 coastal sirens reveals a fundamental truth about our relationship with technology. The same forces that provide us with safety can also be used to enforce our silence. The siren's breath was a test, a demonstration of how easily the invisible landscape of our world can be reclaimed by those who control the frequencies. As we look toward the future of wireless technology, from 5G to satellite constellations, the ghost of 1928 serves as a chilling reminder. We are still living in an environment that can be tuned and tempered. The airwaves are not a vacuum. They are a medium, and that medium has a memory. The investigation concludes not with an answer, but with a question. In a world increasingly defined by invisible signals, who is watching the sirens? And when the fog rolls in again, what frequency will be used to silence the next generation of voices? The coastal sirens are silent now, their brass bells rusting in the salt air. But the dead zones remain, and the etched copper still tells the story of the night the air turned against the machines. The frequency remains unknown to the public, a secret locked in a lead-shielded bunker 3 generations deep.